We had been planning this camping trip for weeks. 4 of us, all friends from high school, decided we needed a break from the relentless grind of work and city life. What better way to unwind than to immerse ourselves in the wild? No phones, no emails, just us, nature, and the endless sky. It felt like the perfect escape. The campground was isolated deep in a forest that stretched for miles. We'd specifically chosen it because of how remote it was, far from the busy national parks and overrun campgrounds. The only way in was a narrow dirt road that snaked through the dense trees. As we drove up, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the woods. The trees were tall, unnaturally so, and their thick branches formed a canopy that swallowed the light. When we finally reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, something about the place felt off. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my gut as I stepped out of the car. At first, the silence seemed peaceful, but as I stood there, taking it all in, it became clear that this wasn't a normal silence. It was heavy, almost like the air itself was thick with something unseen. No birds, no wind, no sound at all. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing more than the stark contrast to the city's noise. The others seemed unfazed, so I shrugged it off and helped unpack the tents. We laughed, joked, and tried to ignore the creeping sense that we were the only living things in the forest. The fire crackled as night fell. We roasted marshmallows, passed around beers, and told ghost stories, but no matter how much we tried to distract ourselves, that silence lingered. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt wrong. At night, I couldn't sleep. Every breath I took felt amplified. Every small movement exaggerated in the quiet. I lay on my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, trying to listen for something, anything that would break the unnatural stillness. But there was nothing. My friends slept soundly around me, their soft snores the only sign of life in this otherwise dead world. At some point, I dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a feeling I couldn't quite place. It was as if I'd heard something, though I couldn't remember what. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained my ears, listening for the source. But again, silence. The kind that presses down on you, makes your skin crawl. I stepped outside the tent, careful not to wake anyone. The fire had long since died, leaving only glowing embers, casting an eerie orange glow around the campsite. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of a deer or some other wildlife. But the forest was still, too still. Then I heard a soft breath right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart leaped into my throat, every hair on my body standing on end. For a long moment, I stood frozen, listening for the sound again. But all I heard was the blood pounding in my ears. Maybe I was just imagining it. I had to be. I convinced myself that it was just nerves and retreated to the tent, pulling the sleeping bag up tight around me. But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. From the trees, from the shadows, something unseen. The morning brought no relief. If anything, the forest felt even more hostile in the daylight. We decided to go on a hike, hoping that moving around would distract us from the unease that hung over the campsite. But the further we walked into the woods, the quieter it became. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The deeper we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. I didn't say anything at first, not wanting to spook the others, but I could tell by their faces that they felt it too. The laughter from the previous day was gone, replaced by an unspoken tension that none of us wanted to address. After an hour, we turned back. We didn't talk about it, didn't discuss why we were cutting the hike short, but I knew something was wrong here. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was listening. By the time we returned to the campsite, the oppressive silence had become suffocating. Every movement felt wrong, like we were being observed. We made an early dinner, not talking much. Even the sound of the fire seemed muted, as if the very air around us was thickening, pressing in on us from all sides. Then, just as we were starting to relax, Henry stood up. He didn't say a word, didn't look at us, just walked into the woods. At first, we thought he was going to relieve himself, but as the minutes ticked by, unease settled in. We called after him, but there was no response. 20 minutes passed, then an hour. Fear gripped me as we split up to search the immediate area. We stayed close to the campsite, afraid to venture too far into the trees. The forest felt alive now, waiting. Every step felt like a risk. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was watching us from just beyond the tree line. But there was no sign of Henry. We regrouped at the campfire, panic setting in. We tried to convince ourselves that he'd just gotten lost, but we all knew that wasn't true. Henry didn't just disappear. Something took him. The atmosphere shifted that night. The fear that had been slowly building now overwhelmed us. We sat in silence around the campfire, eyes darting to the forest, each of us afraid to say what we were all thinking. We weren't alone. At some point, we all retreated to our tents, hoping that sleep would come and take us away from the nightmare. But as the hours passed, the silence grew unbearable. I could feel it, that presence just outside the tent, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. I heard it again, the soft breath. This time it wasn't just behind me. It was all around us. I held my breath, terrified to make a sound. Something brushed against the outside of the tent, a gentle, almost curious touch. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I lay there paralyzed, my heart racing. Whatever it was testing us, toying with us, waiting for us to make a mistake. By the time the sun rose, one more of us was gone. We didn't see or hear them leave, but their tent was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the site. They had just vanished. We packed up as fast as we could, our hands shaking as we threw everything into the car. No one said a word. There was nothing to say. We knew what had happened, even if we couldn't explain it. As we sped away, the forest finally let out the breath it had been holding. The weight lifted, but the fear didn't leave us. I still feel it even now, far from that cursed place. The silence, that deep, unnatural stillness, it hasn't left me. I hear it in the quiet moments, just before sleep takes me. I know it's still watching. When I first walked into the apartment, it felt like a dream come true. After months of searching for a place that wasn't a complete dump, I finally found one with charm and affordability. The building was old, but the apartment itself was spacious, with tall windows, hardwood floors, and enough character to feel like a home. I didn't mind that it came with a roommate, someone I hadn't met yet. The landlord mentioned the roommate was quiet and often worked late shifts, meaning I'd likely have the place to myself most of the time. Perfect for someone who valued their solitude as much as I did. The first few days were blissfully quiet. The only sign of my supposed roommate was a locked door at the end of the hallway. I assumed they were away for work, and that was fine by me. I took the time to unpack, decorate, and settle into my new life. But then, the strange noises began. It started at night. A faint shuffle, like someone moving around in the next room, muffled behind the walls. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old buildings made noise. Pipes creaked, wood expanded, and my roommate could have come home without me noticing. But it didn't take long for the sounds to grow louder, footsteps that seemed to echo in the hall, faint whispers just beyond my hearing. One evening, as I sat reading in the living room, I heard the distinct sound of a door creaking open. I glanced down the hallway, expecting to finally meet the elusive person who shared the apartment. But when I looked, the door at the end of the hall, the one that had always been closed, remained shut. I felt my skin prickle with unease. I stood up, walking quietly to the door. I knocked, but no one answered. The whispers and footsteps that had felt so distant moments ago seemed to vanish into the silence. I tried the handle, but it was locked, just as it had been since I moved in. Suddenly, A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, just a brief, blurry movement near the door. My heart raced as I spun around, but there was no one there. The next few nights were worse. It wasn't just the whispers or footsteps anymore, it was the shadows. They danced along the walls, sometimes in the corner of my eye, sometimes darting across the room. At first I thought I was seeing things, but the shadows always seemed to move just where I couldn't catch them. I kept telling myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more intense the feeling grew that I wasn't alone. Even when the apartment was empty, I could sense it, a presence. One night, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure why, but I felt the distinct urge to look toward the door of my bedroom. The dim light from the street barely illuminated the hallway, but in the faint glow, I saw a figure standing there, just inside my doorframe. It wasn't clear like a person, but more of a silhouette. Thin and tall, it just stood there, unmoving. I froze, fear gripping me. I wanted to reach for the lamp on my nightstand, but I was paralyzed, staring at the figure, unable to move or even breathe. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The hallway was empty again, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. After that, I couldn't shake the growing dread that something was wrong with this apartment. I asked the landlord about the roommate, but his responses were always vague, just that they were away a lot for work, always keeping to themselves. He acted as if it was normal, but there was a discomfort in his voice, like he didn't want to talk about it. I tried everything to ignore the sounds, the shadows, but they only grew more frequent. Every night I heard someone moving around, though I never saw anyone coming or going. There were times I swore I saw the figure standing at the end of the hallway again, always just in the dark. One day I decided to confront my fears. I had to know if there was someone or something living behind that locked door. I waited until evening, my heart racing as I approached the door again. This time I tried the knob, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. Dust coated the floor, and the air was heavy with the scent of age and decay. No signs of life, no belongings, no furniture, just an empty room. But there was something else, a coldness, that hit me the moment I stepped inside, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees. I felt a chill run through me, but I couldn't back out now. As I stood there, taking in the eerie stillness of the room, I heard it again, those whispers, clearer this time. They came from all around me, faint and disembodied. I rushed out, my heart hammering, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care if I lost the deposit or had nowhere else to go. Something was wrong with that place, and I wasn't going to stay long enough to find out what. As I made my way down the stairs, I ran into the landlord. He looked at me knowingly, as if he'd seen this before. The roommate, I asked, was there ever really anyone else living here? And he hesitated, his face tight with an expression I couldn't read. Then, after a long pause, he simply said, "Not for a long time." I left without another word, feeling the weight of the apartment's silence following me out the door. As I drove away, I glanced back at the building one last time. In one of the windows, high up in the shadows, I could have sworn I saw a figure watching me leave. I've always been a night owl, which is why Reddit became my home. Scrolling through endless threads, chatting with strangers, it kept the loneliness at bay. My apartment was small but cozy, a one-bedroom unit in a nondescript building. There was nothing particularly strange about the place, no ominous history, no creepy neighbors, just a quiet, ordinary space where I lived my life, until the shadow appeared. It started about 2 weeks ago, and I remember it clearly because I'd been up late, as usual, typing away on my computer. My bedroom light was off, with only the dim glow of the screen illuminating the room. I stretched and turned my head toward the door to the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just behind the door. It wasn't moving, just there, a shadowy silhouette framed in the darkness. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the shape didn't disappear. It wasn't solid, it didn't look like a person exactly, but it had a form, a tall, thin outline, unnaturally still. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment I considered calling someone, anyone, but I was frozen. Instead, I stayed where I was, staring at the door, hoping the figure would just vanish. It didn't move, not once. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a shadow cast by something outside. I was tired, my mind was playing tricks on me. That night, I shut my laptop, turned my back to the door, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing there, watching me. The next night, I was hesitant to even look at the door. I went about my usual routine, half hoping that whatever I'd seen the night before had been a one-time thing. But as soon as I glanced toward the hallway, it was there again. The same shadowy figure, unmoving just behind my door. This time I felt the fear more deeply. My pulse quickened as I stared at the shape, my mind racing to find a irrational explanation. There was something in the hallway casting a shadow. The lights from outside. No, the outline was too clear, too deliberate. I stood up, inching closer to the door, trying to get a better look. But as I approached, the shadow didn't shift or fade. It was as though it were part of the door itself, fused with the darkness. I didn't dare open the door. I backed away slowly and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, eyes locked on the door, the figure still standing there. Every night after that, the shadow returned. Always the same, just standing there, watching. It never moved, never made a sound, but the presence of it was enough to fill me with dread. After nearly a week of sleepless nights, I decided to investigate. I couldn't go on pretending it wasn't happening. I needed to know what was behind that door, or if there was something wrong with me. Was I hallucinating? Sleep deprived? I posted about it on Reddit. I described the shadow in detail, explaining how it appeared every night behind my door but never moved. The responses ranged from sympathetic to dismissive, with some telling me it was just sleep paralysis or stress. But a few people were genuinely freaked out, offering all kinds of paranormal theories, shadow people, hauntings, or an omen of some kind. One comment in particular stood out. The moment it moves, it's already too late. It was meant to scare me, I knew that, but the words stuck with me, burrowing into my mind. What if the shadow never moving was the only thing keeping me safe? That night, I stayed up, waiting. I sat on my bed, eyes locked on the door, watching as the shadow appeared once more. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I waited for it to do something, anything. But like every other night, it just stood there, tall and dark, blending into the shadows behind my door. I don't know how long I watched, but at some point, exhaustion won. My eyes drooped, and before I knew it, I drifted into a restless sleep. The next night, I expected the same thing. By now, the routine had almost become a twisted comfort, the shadow behind my door, looming but never acting. But when I looked toward the door that night, the shadow wasn't there. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had finally stopped. Maybe whatever it was had moved on. I stood up, cautiously walking toward the door, the absence of the shadow both confusing and unsettling. But as I approached the door, I felt a heavy, cold air settle in the room, as though something had been disturbed. I opened the door, my hand shaking slightly. The hallway was empty, just the dim lights and the silence of the apartment. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to understand what had changed. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. That's when I heard a faint shuffle behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. It was in the room now. The shadow, the same one that had stood behind my door for days, was now standing in the corner of my bedroom. This time it wasn't just a shadow on the wall, it had shape, depth, something almost human, but not quite. It stood there, still and silent, but I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I backed away, my mind racing. It had moved. After all these nights, it had finally moved. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the apartment, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the figure in the corner, unable to break free from its grip. Then, just as suddenly as it had moved into the room, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next the corner was empty, as though it had never existed. I collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I couldn't stay here anymore. Whatever this thing was, it had crossed a line. I packed my bags that night, barely able to think straight. I left the apartment and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why it chose to torment me. All I know is that for weeks, it watched from behind my door, waiting until one night it decided to step through. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.